He didn't conquer an empire with swords or guns, he conquered it with belief. When Hernán Cortés met Moctezuma, it wasn't a battle between armies. It was a battle between a gambler and a god, and only one of them understood how to rewrite reality. In 1519, Hernán Cortés faced Moctezuma II at the gates of Tenochtitlan. Most historians focus on the technological mismatch, the steel, the horses, the gunpowder, but the real battle wasn't fought with cannon. It was fought here, points to head. It was a war between the psychology of high-stakes gambling and the paralysis of mythological fatalism, and victory would go to the commander who could master not only his meager force, but the mind of an emperor. This was never a conventional campaign. It was a psychological invasion. To understand what happened, we must first analyze the two rival minds at the center of the conflict. The confrontation was not between a soldier and a king. It was between a gambler and a god. First, the gambler, Hernán Cortés. He was not, by training, a military genius. He was a minor nobleman, a law student who failed to finish his degree, and a brilliant, ruthless opportunist. His entire expedition was, from the start, an act of high treason. He sailed against the explicit orders of his superior, Governor Velázquez of Cuba. This initial defiance is the key to his entire psychological profile. Cortés was a man who had already passed his culminating point before he even landed. He had burned his bridges behind him. For him, there was only victory or the gallows. This cognitive state, a total, irreversible commitment, is rare and dangerous. It removes all other options, sharpening the will to a singular purpose. He led not a disciplined army, but a volatile syndicate of 500 adventurers, all seeking fortune. His primary challenge, therefore, was not strategic, but psychological. He had to manage the greed, fear, and mutinous spirit of his own men, while projecting absolute, unshakable confidence. Now, the god. Moctezuma threw. The Tlatoani of the Mexica was not a weak or indecisive primitive. He was the absolute ruler of a complex, sophisticated, and deeply feared empire. He was a high priest, a seasoned general, and the living embodiment of the state's theological power. But where Cortés's mind was agile, modern, and individualistic, Moctezuma's was communal, cyclical, and deterministic. His entire worldview, his very legitimacy, was bound by a rigid adherence to prophecy and cosmic duty. And for years, his empire had been saturated with portents of doom. Comets, temple fires, the wail of a spectral woman. Into this atmosphere of dread stepped Cortés. His arrival in 1519, coinciding perfectly with the prophesied year, C. Acatal, one read, the very year the pale, bearded god-king Quetzalcoatl was destined to return from the east to reclaim his throne. When Moctezuma's scouts delivered their reports, painting cloth canvases of the floating mountains, ships, the stags they rode, horses, and their fire sticks, muskets, Moctezuma did not see an invading army. He saw a theological crisis. His response was not to mobilize the legions of the Triple Alliance. It was to consult his priests. He was trapped. If he fought these arrivals, and they were gods, his actions would be a catastrophic impiety. If he welcomed them, he risked inviting the empire's destruction. Here we see the first critical error. Moctezuma, the god king, reacted not with strategic calculation, but with fatalistic paralysis. He sent lavish gifts of gold and featherwork, hoping to appease what he perceived as a supernatural force. But to the mind of Cortés, the gambler, this act of religious reverence was read as a fatal concession of weakness. Cortés had his first piece of intelligence, and it was decisive. Moctezuma's gifts were not a show of strength. They were an act of negotiation with a supernatural entity. The gambler immediately understood the terms of this engagement. He was not facing a king. He was facing a man trapped in a theological nightmare. Cortés realized he could not win a war of attrition, but he could win a war of perception. He would not defeat the Aztec Empire. He would psychologically dismantle its leadership. His first and most critical move is often mythologized: the burning of his ships. In reality, he scuttled them, systematically dismantled, and sunk all but one small vessel. Historians correctly note this was a solution to a logistical problem, a way to quell a mutiny among his men who wanted to return to Cuba. But this conventional analysis misses the dual genius of the act. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, aimed at two distinct audiences. First, his own men. By destroying their only means of escape, Cortés created a psychological forcing function. He induced a state of irreversible commitment, a point of no return that welded their individual fates to his. He engineered a sunk cost fallacy on a national scale. There was no retreat. There was only forward, into the unknown, toward impossible wealth or total annihilation. He had created a perfect instrument of will, a small, desperate, and therefore lethally dangerous force. Second, and more importantly, the act was a signal broadcast directly to the mind of Moctezuma. Spies were everywhere. The news would reach Tenochtitlan in days, and the emperor would be forced to ask, what manner of man willingly destroys his floating mountains? Not a diplomat, not a raider, only a man of absolute, almost insane, conviction. This was not the behavior of a human adversary. It was the behavior of a man who did not need an escape route because his victory was preordained. It was, in short, the act of a god. It was performative fanaticism, designed to confirm Moctezuma's darkest fears. This was not an invasion. It was a fulfillment. Now Cortés began his march inland. And here, his psychological strategy evolved. He was not just targeting the emperor, he was co-opting the deep, fractured pathologies of the empire itself. The Mexica ruled through brutal hegemony, exacting tribute from resentful subject states. Cortés encountered the most formidable of these, the Tlaxcalans. They were the empire's mortal enemy, a republic of warriors who had resisted Mexica domination for decades. They fought Cortés with ferocious skill. But after a series of brutal engagements, Cortés did not subjugate them. He recruited them. This alliance was a psychological masterstroke. To Moctezuma, it was a geopolitical impossibility. The Tlaxcalans were the fixed, structural enemy. For this god to arrive from the sea, and in a matter of weeks, unite with the empire's existential threat, this shattered the entire political and cosmic order. Cortés was no longer just a portent. He was an active agent of cosmic upheaval, gathering the empire's enemies as his own. But Cortés knew that divine power required not just allies, but a capacity for terrible, swift judgment. He demonstrated this at Cholula, a city allied with Moctezuma. Hearing rumors of a planned ambush, rumors likely encouraged by his Tlaxcalan allies, Cortés acted with preemptive, calculated brutality. He summoned the city's nobles to a central plaza, and at a signal, his forces and their Tlaxcalan allies fell upon them, massacring thousands. We must analyze this not as a battle, but as a broadcast. The Cholula massacre was a clinical act of psychological terror. It was not strategic. It was symbolic. It was a message intended for Moctezuma's ears, delivered in the language of Mexia warfare, blood and fear. It projected two critical attributes of divinity: omniscience, he knew of the trap, and absolute ruthlessness. He would punish betrayal without mercy. He had shown the two faces of the returning god: the merciful ally to the Tlaxcalans, and the avenging destroyer at Cholula. By the time Cortés stood on the Great Causeway leading into Tenochtitlan on the 8th of November 1519, his physical army was still a relative handful. But his psychological army was vast. He had weaponized the empire's own mythology, confirmed its portents, and embodied its deepest fears. Moctezuma, the God King, was now psychologically encircled. His strategic paralysis was complete. He was not greeting an enemy commander. He was welcoming his own meticulously constructed and self-fulfilled doom. When Moctezuma finally met Cortés on the Great Causeway, dressing him in the sacred vestments of Quetzalcoatl, it was not a diplomatic welcome. It was a cognitive surrender. The war, in its most critical sense, was already over. It had been won, not with a clash of armies, but with an abdication of will. Here, we must be precise. The subsequent capture of Moctezuma in his own palace was not an act of military daring. It was a formality. It was the physical confirmation of a psychological reality. Moctezuma, the ruler of millions, had become a prisoner in his own mind, long before Cortés ever laid a hand on him. This is the catastrophic failure of a deterministic mindset when confronted by a radically opportunistic one. Moctezuma was paralyzed by a profound cognitive dissonance. His senses reported a small band of mortal, grasping, violent men. But his entire theological and political framework, the portents, the prophecies, his identity as a high priest demanded they be gods. To accept the former was to admit his entire worldview was false, that his gods had abandoned him, and that his legitimacy was a lie. To accept the latter, while terrifying, was at least orderly. It was an outcome foretold. He resolved this dissonance by choosing the prophecy. He saw only what his mythology permitted him to see. Cortés, unbound by such dogma, saw only what was useful. He was the ultimate agent of chaos, a man who created facts rather than received them. Where Moctezuma sought to interpret a pre-written cosmic script, Cortés was writing his own. By welcoming this small, terrifying force into the center of gravity of his empire, the heart of Tenochtitlan Moctezuma was not appeasing a guest. He was caging himself. He had seeded the narrative. Cortés had engineered the ultimate asymmetric victory, proving that a state is not just its armies and treasuries. A state is a shared story, and the leader who loses control of that story, who allows an enemy to become the protagonist in his own people's mythology, has already lost the war. The brutal siege and fall of Tenochtitlan, long after Moctezuma's death, was merely the bloody epilogue to a conquest that had already taken place in the mind of its emperor. Moctezuma's worldview was his center of gravity. To abandon it was to abandon his very legitimacy. In his position, facing what appeared to be a fulfilled prophecy, could you have pivoted to a purely strategic mindset? Or is a leader ultimately a prisoner of their own culture? Share your assessment in the comments below.